Hello and welcome to Evo India. I'm Karan Ramgopal, and as you can see, I have something extremely exciting parked right next to me. This here is the Ultraviolette F77, and this is in its final production ready avatar, and it is extremely different from the bike that we rode back in 2019. It gets a bunch of updates in its battery pack, the fairing, the chassis geometry, and even the infotainment system and the controls. They're all new and better now. How all these changes add up and what this bike is like to ride in a go-kart or a racetrack environment like we are right now, or even in the mountain roads, is exactly what we're going to be finding out in the duration of this video. Welcome to our first ride review of the Ultraviolette F77 Recon. Now this Recon badge means that it is the top end variant, barring that 77 unit limited run that they had. So as usual, if you like this video, give us a thumbs up, share it to like-minded enthusiasts, and click on that bell icon to stay notified for all things thrill of riding. Right, so before I tell you about the design of this bike or any of that, I think it's only fair that we talk about its performance, because after all, this is India's first performance electric two-wheeler. Now in terms of number, there are quite a few interesting numbers over here. 10.3 kilowatt hour, that's the size of the battery, making it the largest battery pack in any two-wheeler in India right now. In terms of your motor, you have a motor that outputs 38.8 bhp and 95 newton meters of torque. Now that is a lot, and it does feel quite fast for that as well. In terms of riding modes, you have three to choose from: glide, combat and ballistic. Now as the name suggests, glide is your lowest mode. It's the equivalent of an economy mode in which the priority is range and not power. Then you have combat, which is a middle ground between ballistic and glide. So you have just enough performance and just enough range as well. And then when you want to go all out, that's when you have ballistic. And let me tell you, this bike, the three modes, they actually do feel very different from one another, and that's really nice to see, because you actually do feel like your throttle response is changing quite a bit, and the range numbers also go up on the screen as well. Now these range numbers on the screen are just something I can tell you here, because in the kind of riding that we're doing right now, I can't really do a range test. So more about the actual range figures when we get it back home in Pune for a proper review. So this review is strictly restricted to its performance and handling and things like that. And one thing I did notice, that glide, it is significantly duller than the other two modes, but it is still usable. Like, it was equivalent to a commuter bike, so you're not really scratching your head saying that, oh shit, I need to go so slow. It is usable, it is genuinely usable, and when range does become a concern, I wouldn't mind sticking the bike in glide mode and riding it. But in all honesty, the mode that you want to be leaving this bike in, if you want to be smiling from ear to ear inside your helmet, is ballistic. It is actually quite ballistic. The throttle response is calibrated quite nicely. It's not jerky or it's not snappy, and contrary to what you would expect from an electric motorcycle, it doesn't just dart off the line. It's quite gradual and linear in the way it delivers its power, but once you cross a certain threshold, that's when the power really kicks in. Now this is good for a few reasons, I feel. A, primarily because if you're going to be riding in the city, you really don't want that much torque coming to your rear wheel all in a little turn of the throttle. The fact that you can modulate it, I just feel it's a more safer bike. Second, when you're out riding on a track or anything like that, when the power does go down, now considering this doesn't have a clutch or a gearbox, so there's no engine braking effectively, you don't want to be just rolling the throttle and getting all of that power at once and then just unsettling the bike. The fact that you can linearly modulate the throttle makes you feel that much more confident on the bike. Now, in terms of riding out in the mountains, now we are out in the mountains at Nandi Hills. Now, Nandi Hills is very famously considered as Bangalore's proving grounds for anyone who likes to ride hard and fast. Now over here, you do have a lot of traffic apart from you and your biker friends. There are a lot of trucks going around, there are a lot of cars going around, and when you do want to make a quick overtake, just get out of the lane, roll the throttle gently, and this thing picks up pace beautifully. It's really nice to see. Like, apart from the fact that I'm calibrating my head to ride without a clutch and without a gear lever, I'm really not feeling like I'm not on an internal combustion motorcycle. Yes, there are the obvious telltale signs that there's no exhaust note or none of those vibrations that you associate with a nice motorcycle, but Ultraviolette has done a solid job in packaging and showcasing this motorcycle. Your perception of this bike is that yes, this is a performance motorcycle, and then you think about that, oh yeah, this is also an electric motorcycle. So that definitely is a step in the right direction for the performance aspect of things when you think about two-wheelers in India and even world over, because Ultraviolette is considering, in fact they have a lot of interest from countries in Europe, North America, South America, and other places around the world. So eventually, sometime next year or sometime after that, we can expect Ultraviolette to become a global brand. And for an Indian company, that is great. Right, now in terms of the motor and the running, there are a couple of things I didn't like. Starting with the regen, as it stands in the current software version, in the current firmware version and all of that, there are 3 modes of regen. You have 1, 2 and 3. Now neither of them are aggressive enough where you really feel you're rolling off the throttle and getting any retardation as you would expect from an internal combustion bike. There is no engine braking as such. Now Ultraviolette has promised us that they are working on a more comprehensive regen setup which has 10 modes of regen, and in those modes it will be a lot more aggressive. And there is also another reason why I think the regen thing is going to take a little time, because that will take a lot of fine tuning. Because if you think about it, when you're engine braking and you want to cut the engine braking, you can always just pull the clutch in, but here there is nothing. So they might have to figure out a solution to intervene between the engine braking if mid corner or any of those places you really need to get back on the throttle, or you need the bike to coast. So as it stands, the regen is not as aggressive as I would like it to be, but Ultraviolette does promise that this will be sorted out soon enough. Now, in my time riding this motorcycle, which has been primarily at the go-kart track and here at Nandi Hills, I haven't had any warnings light flash up or the motor go into limp mode, and the temperature has been in check almost throughout. So it does look like Ultraviolette is delivering on their promises of thermal management. But then again, our time with this bike has been very short and not enough to comprehensively tell you whether or not this will hold true in the long run. So that, along with the range numbers, we can only give you once we comprehensively test the bike in our familiar environment. Now, Ultraviolette has snuck in a small update between the launch and to now when we are riding the bikes. Earlier, before the launch and around the launch, if you were to get the bike then, the SoC was calibrated such that if you were riding on ballistic mode, you could ride for effectively 30% of the SoC. So if you start at 100, you can ride till there is 70% charge left. But now what Ultraviolette has done to make sure that we enjoy this as much as we can, they have pretty much flipped it. So now you can ride till you have 30% SoC left and ride for 70%. So if you start at 100%, you can pretty much ride on ballistic mode till your battery drains down to 30%. And that, I think, is great for an enthusiast who's looking to get one of these bikes. Right, now in terms of performance, this is priced pretty close to a more expensive 300 or 400, but the real feeling of performance is closer to that of a 250 to a 300. So in ballistic mode, on the short straight that we had in the go-kart track with my weight, I managed to touch around 105 before having to brake for the corner. So that is quite nice, because on an equivalent ICE motorcycle, I feel something like a KTM Duke 250, or in fact I would relate this closer to 75% performance of that of a Duke 390. So it's quite respectable in that sense, and it does feel fast. And like I said, that linear throttle motion, it really does help in keeping everything in check. Right, now to make sure that you can extract every ounce of performance that this motor has to offer and also make full use of those 95 Newton meters of torque, you need a solid chassis setup. And if my time at that go-kart track proved anything, it is that this bike does have a solid chassis setup. Swing a leg over and you're greeted by a very comfortable 800mm saddle height. Now the bike is a little wide because of its battery, but it's not too wide that you can't flat-foot it. I'm 5'10" and I have zero issues flat-footing both bikes, and as you can see, I have a nice kink going on as well, which means, see, this is the problem with an electric bike, there's no gear holding it back. Anyways, which means even shorter riders should be able to comfortably get on this bike. Now the rider's triangle, it is fairly committed. It is not as aggressive as a proper track-bred super sport, but I definitely wouldn't call it a naked bike either. You know, my feet, as you can see, are pretty rear set, and my hands are also a fair bit down. Now, they're not as down as you would be on a super sport, but again, it is still pretty aggressive. Handlebar, nice and wide, and it offers quite a bit of leverage in corners. So you are pretty comfortable if you're in a track environment. So that is good. Now, to prevent the bike rolling back further, I think I'm just going to get off and continue this. The primary thing that I need to mention is that this is a heavy bike. Yes, it does make 38.8 bhp and 95 Newton meters of torque, but this does also weigh 207 kilos. So that is quite a bit of heft, and while getting it off the stand, you do feel a bit of that heft, and at slow speeds and at slow speed corners, you will feel that when you're trying to change direction from side to side. But apart from that, get the speed slightly high, say cross 30, 40, 50, and then this bike really starts to shrink itself around you. You really don't feel those 207 kilos anymore, and you really have a good time tipping it from corner to corner. The weight is front biased, so you do feel a little heft steering it, but at the same time it does also feel extremely planted. Now this is down to its chassis setup and also those tires. Now these are MRF tires that are made bespoke for this bike. They've not hit the market yet, but when you get your Ultraviolette, there is a good chance they will be wearing these MRF tires, and they are W rated tires, so they are high speed rated as well. Now in terms of suspension, you have 41mm upside down forks at the front and a monoshock at the rear. And the best part is this Recon variant, which is currently the top end variant considering the 77 units are sold out, does get preload adjustability at both ends. So once you do get it, make sure you set it up for your weight, set the sag properly, and the suspension will work really well, because even as it is set up right now with my weight, it's dealing with all the bumps and potholes of Nandi Hills beautifully. There's a lot of composure when it is going over things, and it doesn't jolt back up to your spine. But at the same time, when I was at the go-kart track, barring the fact that I felt like I should have tuned the preload just a little bit for the front, it felt solid and it inspired confidence throughout. So did the tires. You could get to the edge of the tire without really feeling like you are out of grip. So that is commendable. Now you are dealing with a lot of weight, and there's also a lot of performance on tap, and you need to be able to slow this down, and you need to do this in a controlled manner. And to that end, I think Ultraviolette has done a good job with the brakes. It also ties in with how well the suspension is set up and the chassis is set up. But yeah, the brakes, you get a 320mm rotor up front, which is bit onto by a 4-piston radial caliper by Bybrake, and at the rear you have a 230mm disc with a single piston caliper. You have dual channel ABS on both ends, but Ultraviolette will allow you to switch off the rear, so you can get some rear out tail action if you would like so. Now the ABS, it wasn't intrusive, and no point at the track, even despite hard braking or trail braking into a corner, did I ever feel the ABS come on. That is really comforting and assuring. Now in terms of brake pads, you have sintered brake pads at the front, so you have more aggressive bite. Now why I am stressing on braking for this bike is because you don't have engine braking, and that is something you really need to recalibrate to when you're riding out on track. So you can't really go down the gears and hope that the engine braking will allow you to slow down and brake just that much later and get off the brakes that much sooner. Because you have to deal with no engine retardation whatsoever, you're relying on the brakes that much more than you would. So you do need a solid setup, and this does have a nice setup. They're progressive, they're sharp, and you can modulate them quite well. Right, so now as you can see, this bike here, it doesn't have tank grips because this is a stock bike, but the bikes that we were out riding on track did have tank grips, and they really did change the way you ride. Because again, like I said, this whole thing comes back to the fact that there's no engine braking, so there's a lot more weight on the front when you're braking through the corners. So if you do have the tank grips to grip onto, you're just taking away that much more weight from your hands and transferring it down as it should be. So when you do get this bike, do make sure that you invest in those tank grips. Alright, now that we have covered ride and handling, performance and all of that, I think it's time we talk about the design, because the design of this bike is quite striking. It's definitely one that's going to turn tons of eyes on the road, and with good reason. Now, the bike has undergone quite a few changes from the iteration in 2019, the prototype that we wrote, to now this production ready variant. And there are a few reasons for that, which I'll get to in just a moment. But they have stayed true to the concept that they promised. The fighter design, it remains. The sharp cuts, the sharp creases and lines all over, the fork covers, this thing here, which also serves a second purpose, which I'll get to in a minute, and the sharp rear end, they all go really well, and they really give the bike a nice aesthetic. Ultraviolette has ditched the 3 swappable detachable battery method, and now they've opted for a single fixed battery unit, which is why you don't have any panels that pop open. And this fin that I was telling you about earlier is essentially a cover for the crash guard for the battery. So there is a nice little guard that goes something like this with a small fin coming out. Now this sits on top of that, and it also serves an aesthetic purpose along with looking really nice. So that is small attention to detail that they have really focused on. But the design is not perfect. If you can see, there are a lot of plastic panels everywhere, and they're all tightly bunched up together. Now plastic it will eventually start to rub against each other, and there already is creaking right now. Ultraviolette is aware of this, and they're working on addressing it as soon as possible. I just hope that happens before the deliveries begin. And even things like this, like if I take the steering from lock to lock, there's barely space for me to put a paper through this. So I don't know how nicely that will age in the long run, but I surely hope that they have figured out a solution for that as well. And then the second thing that I'm not too fond of in the design is the mirrors. I mean, sure, they look great, but they don't serve a very functional purpose right now. They're just a bit too narrow in my opinion. They should have been a little more out. And the adjusting mechanism is essentially you popping this around, which doesn't feel very sturdy, and I'm not really confident touching the glass. I don't like doing that. So I would have hoped they had a better mechanism for that. But that is certainly something we can expect in the future. Now, apart from this, Ultraviolette has also developed panniers for this. Now you can either put two Ultraviolette panniers on the side, which look pretty nice and they go with the design, or to carry the larger fast charger that they provided, 3.3 kilowatt hour fast charger, Ultraviolette also has mounting straps that are mounted directly on the frame. So they are more load bearing, they can hold a lot more weight than just a pannier mount mounted over here. And they can just tuck out and come out, and you have slots or mount different panniers on them as well. So that's a nice little design touch over there. So overall, in my opinion, this design is great, but these few things need to be rectified. Right, now in terms of features, this has everything you would expect from a modern day bike. You have a color TFT display, different riding modes, smartphone connectivity, turn-by-turn navigation on screen, you get notifications and all of that. And like I said, because this is an electric bike, you also get a lot of features like telemetry, where you can find the nearest charger and all of that. Apart from that, Ultraviolette is also setting up a charging grid pan-India, and that is also in the works. So you will also be able to navigate through all of that within the app. Now, let's talk about what you're more interested in, whether you should be considering this bike or not. Now, for this Recon variant, which is the top end variant that you can buy, this costs rupees 4,55,000 ex showroom. Now that is a pricey price tag. But if you think about it, if you equate it, the kind of performance it has, and if you equate it to a similarly powered ICE bike, in 5 years, according to Ultraviolette's calculation, you'd have made up the difference because of how easy this is to maintain. You have barely any service parts, just your brake pads, your discs, setting up your forks every now and then, changing the fluids for that, and that's about it. And your charging is pretty affordable because you're charging off the grid. So that in the long run should equate things, but still 4,55,000 is a big amount to pay. But if you think about it, scooters, your Olas, your TVSs, all of those also cost north of a lakh, but they aren't nearly as involving as something like this. So in my opinion, this does still have some flaws. Like I said, the creaking in the fairing, the mirrors and all of that, it still needs to come up to mark, and the fact that you don't have an internal combustion noise to drown those noises out makes that a little more apparent. The lack of stronger regen, which is something we are expecting a fix for soon. But I don't think there are cons that outweigh the pros that this bike offers. The superior handling, the performance, the good braking, great tires, the overall package and the stunning design. So I feel if you have the money and you want to invest in the technology of tomorrow, I think this is a great place to start, and this is certainly going to set some benchmarks for performance EVs to come.